Hello, I'm Travis Perkins, Vice President of Customer Experience at Join. And today we're going to be talking about creating flexibility and connectivity and data for re-occupancy. We have a couple of guests with us as well, and we'll get right into it. So what is Join? At Join, we are smart building and workplaces, really all in one. So think about it from a connect, secure, sense, and automate perspective. The reality is what we're providing is faster, more reliable, and more secure and easier to manage internet, Wi-Fi, and of course VPN. Now that's the connect aspect. Once you're connected, how do we actually secure it? A big portion of that is not only basic things like internet security, so individual user authentication and firewalls and things like that, but it's so much about making sure that the right traffic, the right data goes to the right places. And part of that is also then sensing and automating. From a sense and automate perspective, it's really about providing richer real-time analytics, but also something that's much more approachable for building owners and operators, something that they can really get value out of day one. At Join, we're always delivered as a service with no CapEx. And of course, we're really about aiming for a lower total cost of ownership. And we're always up to date, meaning everything that we deploy will constantly be refreshed so that we're providing the best experience for you and your occupier tenants. Join's view of CRE changes in the wake of COVID-19, what we're really seeing is a push for digital transformation for building owners to really sort of meet or exceed their tenant and occupier expectations as it pertains to creating an environment that obviously meets all of the health and safety requirements that are really expected in the space. How do I ensure that the space is actually being not only cleaned regularly, but that social distancing is being enforced and that there are guidelines in place, and how do you communicate those effectively? A big part of that is also deploying the right set of tools and functionality and products. And so much of that can then create sort of this spaghetti web of networks and realistically new issues for owners and occupiers realistically to deal with. And so part of what Join is really talking about is making that really easy, right? So making that effort of deploying networks that are really converged, that can serve so many different purposes, connecting your HVAC or connecting your access control, all of those things that are really important and critical, especially in the time of COVID, connecting those both securely, but then also reliably to wherever that data needs to go. A big portion of really this push for a digital transformation is obviously competition for occupants. With everyone sort of starting to work from home, or continuing to work from home, that push to get people back, there needs to be other things that make the space, again, more inviting, more trusting, more healthy to get that return back, get those folks returning back into the office. And then again, a big portion of that is obviously the data and automation. So we talked about connecting, securing, but then automating. So doing things like tracking people through a space and understanding who is where and when, so that you can enforce different things like social distancing measures, enforce or allow different touchless and self-service type machines. Again, there's that criticality of that network being there on day one is incredibly crucial. So now how does this work in sort of horizontally laid out in terms of applying this technology to really bring value to not only the building itself, the operator, but also to the tenants effectively as well. And so initially, it's really about that connect, right? So building IT and OT infrastructure, all of that legacy technology, essentially, in some cases, it's the DSL line that's powering access control devices or HVAC in terms of connecting to the cloud. But we really believe that low latency, high throughput is really the only way to achieve that. And so that's a big portion of what we do, is just getting that baseline infrastructure in place and then building use cases on top of that. So now once we've connected, it can't just be that. There is an aspect of securing. And so with us, again, securing can be as far as making sure that you're compliant on a SOC 2 or cyber GRX level, but it can also be as simple as making sure that the person that's actually connecting to that network or connecting to that particular tool is the person that should be connecting to that tool. And then lastly, it's really important that the data that is generated from all of these systems is actually, in fact, going to the right location. In some cases, you can have data that is leaking or exposing personal identifiable information and totally be unaware of it. But if you're in control of those traffic flows, if you will, you have a much better sense of your attack surface area and the ability to, again, secure that. Once we've now connected and secured, now it's really about building analytics and data and interesting value outside of those of that network. And so the network is really just about getting that base level on there. And now that we have the network deployed, we can use it in really interesting ways. So using the network as a sensor, as an example, tracking people or devices through a particular space is one of those criticalities that is really no longer a nice to have. It's really a must have. And then, of course, enabling smarter workplaces. So this is really the automate aspect of it. And then through that, it's really about creating additional brand value and value around the building. And of course, showing a level of health and safety to really ensure trust in the building and get folks back in. Now, I'm super excited to chat with Reid Snyder, Director of Corporate Development at HQO. One of the reasons why I'm really excited about this is we're really kicking off our relationship. HQO recently launched an HQS program that we are part of, as well as HQO being part of Join's Office Re-Occupy Toolkit. So thank you, Reid, again, for your time and for speaking with us.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So I'll just dive right into it and really kind of come at it from the lens, I would say, around tenant engagement. And so kind of with that in mind, how do owners think about the tangible and brand value of tenant engagement?
If you think about, what are the tangible benefits there, the value created, we kind of separate into three things. One is around attraction. So are you retaining or attracting new tenants? How can you directly impact your revenue and your NOI by bringing in new tenant bases and retaining tenants long term? The other is fragmentation. So there's over 7,000 prop tech companies. It's become a really positive growth segment. But one of the offshoots there is that for landlords who are not traditionally technology organizations are left needing to separate the signal from noise and identify these best solutions and deploy technology at an enterprise scale in a way that they haven't done before. Yeah. And then differentiation. So, keeping up with the Joneses, this is severely impacting the day-to-day business of landlords in terms of adopting new technology and deploying technology and creating more value for their tenant base. You can kind of no longer just give a black box to a tenant company and expect them to run with that. How do you differentiate from amenitization, from your brand, from the different technologies that you're providing on site, that type of thing? And how does it done in one sort of presentation?
Yeah. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, and I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of building owners now are realizing that they do need to build a brand, not only around themselves, but also on an individual building level. And so I think that's exactly, you sort of hit it on the head, where it's important to cut through the noise, provide that brand or show that brand, but in a way that they're not technologists, right? So they're not going to necessarily just build all of these apps in-house. So how do they ensure that their brand still is present, but there's still a level of functionality and usability and friendliness, approachability for the tenants to use as well?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we have, the majority of our applications are white labeled on behalf of a landlord customer, meaning that whether it's on a specific asset basis. So, we work with the Willis Tower in Chicago. It's a truly iconic asset, and they wanted to wrap the brand around the Willis Tower. We work with large landlords who, like Vornado or Hudson Pacific Properties, who are looking to deploy across their full portfolio and have the brand attached, really for the first time in a technical way, to their applications that they're providing for tenants. So that's super important. It identifies you as a tech-enabled asset, as a tech-enabled owner. It certainly plays into the differentiation as you look at the competitive market, and are you able to compete? The most important thing, backing up slightly, to a tenant company is obtaining talent and retaining talent. And are you able to help compete or hire one more person for that tenant company by providing a tenant experience that is tech-enabled, that is amenitized? If you look at the shifts just in the office landscape over the last 10 years, and a lot of it's come out of the Googles of the world, the large technology companies, but how are you providing these amenities and services directly to the tenant base? And that's something that can be now attached to the brand of the landlord, which has historically not really been something that they've been able to almost take credit for, and now trying to enable that. And to your point about having all these different systems, it's an ineffective way, and it's a poor user experience, and that's something that we really key in on as well, is that tenant experience is, or commercial real estate is now a user experience business. It's finally kind of reached this segment. And if you were to take a look at all the different functionality, from connectivity to access control to order ahead food and different retail and e-commerce solutions, all these things that we wrap into one app, you in theory as a landlord could be asking your tenant base to download a dozen different applications just to use the building.
Right.
And that's a really poor user experience, and bundling that all under one, under your brand, is pretty powerful.
Who doesn't like scrolling through endless amounts of apps just to get in the building and do some basic things?
I think the average person uses, what, 5 to 7 apps in reality. And if you're not one of those 5 to 7, it's a tough hill to climb. And you certainly can't be asking people to use more than that.
Yeah, no doubt. Kind of, I would say, maybe not necessarily switching gears, but really focusing on the now, if you will, in terms of COVID and the pandemic and what we're dealing with. How do you see that as in terms of how has it changed or accelerated how owners are really approaching tenant engagement?
Yeah, I think fortunately it's been an increased need. It's moving this transition from, is amenitization and tenant engagement, is that a vitamin or a painkiller? And I think what we are seeing, our growth in the market has signified that it's a painkiller, but I think COVID and the response and how can you disseminate information, really hammer home that direct relationship with the end user, create communication channels, all these things. I think it's been an accelerant and a need for this type of application and this segment as a whole. You need to be able to have direct communication. That's something that's historically been fragmented. You find landlords and property teams typically have key few contacts with the tenant company. They've got the person on the lease, they have the office manager, but they're dealing with not only a limited population of the entire building that they can communicate with in that way. They're depending on fragmented toolkit, whether it's email blasts, and then depending upon that person to send it on to their tenant company and so on and so forth. So by being able to have direct, whether it's through push notifications, whether it's through emergency communication software and partners that we work with, the ability to disseminate information effectively and quickly is something that's really driven the growth of the segment, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. And I would say that also it seems like the days of the owner sort of having a real strict firewall in terms of interactions between themselves and the tenants, they sort of have traditionally, I think, left a lot more up to the tenants. It feels like now there's more of a need to be engaged with tenants on a regular basis, if not at the very least to provide some level of trust, right? If you don't have lines of communication, how can you assume to have some level of trust or growing trust?
Yeah, and in this temporary environment that we're living in, while most of your tenant base, if not all in some cases over the past few months, are not physically in the property, what are ways that you can provide value? Can you do it through some digital content? Can you find partnerships? And these are all things that we've been really focused on over the last few months are, can you mesh the digital and physical worlds in a way that provides value while those people are not physically in the office, whether that's through different content and different amenities and perks, or, certain retail benefits and transactions that we can try to foster that are a little bit different than the typical status quo that we knew before March. And then I also think just because everything is a moving target right now, different geographies and states have different policies, different phased approaches to bringing people back to the office. Different companies have their own policies over how actively someone needs to be coming back. Different buildings have the same policies as well. Then the impetus for having real clear communication and transparency over what is an asset owner doing, what are they doing to enable safe and effective entry into a building, use of a building? What are they doing in terms of cleaning those assets? So as we've had this moving target, both from a regulation perspective, but also just in personal comfort level, how are you able to communicate what you're doing to be the best host you can be in that space? Is super important. And then also being able to solicit feedback. It's not a one-way street. And so we've been doing polling and certain things like that to be able to actually gauge from the tenant base, how actively are you trying to get back into the office? What population of your company is looking to get back into the office? What are your concerns? What are your anxieties about getting back into the space? What are some amenities that we can provide that may ease those anxieties, that type of thing. So it's really been a driver for a lot of that use case.
I love that. That's super interesting. And I'm actually curious on some of those features, if you will, less of the actual products. I think the making that connection and opening up those lines of communication is super important. But then if you kind of think about those features or functionality that folks are looking for, are you seeing specific demand for some of those features, both I think in the now in terms of the COVID world, but then also into the future?
Yeah, and I think we've tried to really hone in on focus, and it is a bit of a moving target. But what are
Sure.
those features and functionalities that have staying power versus are somewhat perhaps opportunistic? So can we identify what is truly a paradigm shift in how people are going to be using physical office space, how they're going to be engaging? Those are the ones that we want to be really focused on. There's certainly going to be some short-term implications and some elements that we maybe integrate into the applications that we provide and things like that. But we've really tried to hone in on what is going to be a lasting change, or if it's not a change, what provides lasting value. So some of the areas that I think are particularly important are security and control. So you hear contactless an awful lot.
Yeah.
How can you provide contactless access into the space and throughout the space? And that's really an extension of what we and a lot of access control companies have been doing for a few years now. But how do you take it a step further? How do you not only get into the building, into the front door, but like maybe get to your destination dispatch to your elevator? How do you then also get up to your suite level and do all of this in a way that's contactless? These are different types of feature sets that are very possible, but we hadn't really had the impetus to be able to deploy some of those technologies and use them in that way. And so those are some of the changes we're actively seeing happening. So certainly access is one of them. We've seen a fair amount of focus from landlords on visitor management as a result, which is kind of an extension there, but also I would say just broadly operations and people flow. So if you're working through visitor management software, you're able to maybe do a questionnaire on, has someone had access or has someone had exposure to an individual with COVID? Have they had a test? Have they traveled somewhere that was potentially at risk? That type of thing. So you can start to gauge that type of information based on who's visiting the building. So not just your full-time tenants, but also those that are coming onto the property that you don't have day-to-day engagement with. That's something of interest. And then when you think about all this implementation of new technology, you can have use cases where if you don't operationally have some solutions, they can actually be somewhat negative introduction. So if you're saying only 4 people are allowed on an elevator, but you haven't thought about the queuing that may result of having a backlog of a big building population come in and now only a certain percentage be able to take the elevators at a time that once could, what are you doing to enable social distancing and things like that in a safe and effective manner in the lobby while people are waiting at 8:45 in the morning to get upstairs, that type of thing. So there's a lot of operational elements that need to be thought through to be able to effectively deploy the technology. And then I think the last one that we've been focused in, and it overlaps with what I just suggested, both in operations and in security and control, but is how do you stand up retail and some of these amenities? Obviously retail has been hit particularly hard, but also how do you, when people come back to the office, how do you give them so much of this amenitization and value that you were providing beforehand in a way that's safe and consistent? So whether that's with order ahead food or the ability to do contactless food delivery and through different kiosks and things like that, how do you maybe set up an understanding of how busy the ground floor retail is so that it's a better time and a safer time to go downstairs and get your sandwich, doing things in a contactless manner. Those are all, I would say, the 3 big buckets that we've really been focused on. In addition to trying to provide as much information communication on health and wellness and some additional partnerships there as well.
That's super interesting. And I think actually one of the things that I'm finding really interesting nowadays is, I would never think that in the future I would need to open an app and schedule my elevator trip up. But I think, going back to, again, providing a level of trust, if I have some more sense of my flow of my day, so that horizontal elevator, if you will, if I can get a better sense of, as an example, public transportation and how full it might be, but then also the elevator vestibules and then of course my office as well, that gives me a little bit more trust in making that journey, if you will, or that trek back to the office. And I think it's really relevant stuff that you're mentioning there. And I would say another level that we're sort of thinking about as well is how do we utilize, especially for Join, the infrastructure that we've deployed in new and interesting ways. And one of those that we're seeing is really utilization and location data, right? So who's coming into the space, how long are they spending there, where are they spending that space or their time in that space, and those types of questions. If you kind of had a magic wand or thinking kind of outside of the box, beyond kind of what we just talked about, what do you see as some use cases for that utilization and location data as well?
Yeah, I think our current environment's definitely been a driver for that segment. Historically, and this is still a very serviceable use case and a driver behind the growth of the segment. But historically, the ask was typically, can we measure the number of people in this space so that we understand, the type of investments that we maybe are making in tenant amenity lounges or conference room spaces and things like that. Can we get a better understanding of, 4 people use a conference room versus 2, and what that means for energy usage? Do we need to be keeping the lights on for that? So those are all still very active and pertinent use cases. What we've seen, I think, is an expansion of that technology to both be incredibly valuable data to inform landlords and operators on who's using their property and how, figure out some of those flows, the queuing, things like that, understand the investments they're going to make in future spaces based on usage data across their portfolio. But then there's been kind of a really productive and a shift towards tenant-facing utility as well for that type of data. So if you're able to understand, just kind of going back to some of the examples that I was alluding to, that maybe the food hall or the downstairs retail is particularly busy. That's great information. I'm going to be able to I'm going to order head food. I'm going to order my sandwich. I'm going to have that delivered to the application upstairs. Maybe there's, landlords have made a ton of investments in the past few years on fitness centers and things like that. Maybe particularly given the current environment, I don't want to go down there when it's, busy or maybe I'm looking to use a particular machine. If I'm able to see that, hey, this is a particularly low time for the fitness center because there's not many people there because I can tell from the location data, I'm going to go down and either book my class or I'm going to go down and use the treadmill because I know there's very few people using that space currently. So you can start to we always try to think of value as it pertains to a day in the life of a tenant. So things like, can you help their commute? So what do you do in terms of mobility? Can you help their access to the building? Can you help them provide and procure these amenities? All these things tie into the day-to-day life of a tenant. What are ways that we can add to that value? And I think some of those use cases that are tenant-facing have become particularly interesting. And it also is kind of that first layer for some other technologies and introduction of other technologies. So if you have the basic location data, you have sensors in place and that infrastructure, that enables you to start to add on things like wayfinding of varying degrees or the ability to introduce other technologies and have that basic layer of foundation to be able to build upon. And that's, we're a platform business. A platform requires something to be built upon, and being able to have that infrastructure for location data, I think, is a particular thing that's going to become really table stakes.
Yeah. Well, fantastic, Reid. This was absolutely amazing. A lot to unpack there, but absolutely amazing. And we can't wait to do more with HQO. And we're very excited for our future together. And so thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Travis. Appreciate it.
Take care. Where are we now? The reality is real estate is evolving from an asset really into a business. No longer is it just, I buy this particular property, I maybe do some things to enhance it, and that is it. It really is turning it into a brand, especially as we heard about from Reid there just a moment ago. It really is about building a brand around your properties. And now I am happy to introduce Mark Gilbreath, founder and CEO of LiquidSpace. And how the tables have turned. He's also the host of the Flexible Office Economy podcast, which if you haven't tuned in, please do. So Mark Gilbreath, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Travis, it's a pleasure. And yes, how the tables have turned.
Don't grade me too difficultly, please. Excellent. So I'll just dive right in. And again, we are partners and have been for some time. There's been a number of projects that we've worked on, and we know that that will only continue, and we're super excited for the future of our relationship, but also of LiquidSpace as a whole. So if I had to kind of think about it from an enterprise perspective, because I think that's really interesting in sort of getting into the enterprise customer mindset, how are enterprises really approaching enabling workers during the pandemic and also reoccupancy? And so what are you kind of seeing as some of those patterns or those common threads across enterprises?
Sure. While every company probably applies its own branding and terminology, sequence of steps that they're taking, broadly speaking, everyone's following a fairly similar arc. And it began with triage, right? When the full dimensions of the COVID pandemic, this invisible enemy, revealed itself in really, frankly, March. Triage was all about health and safety. And through that lens, campuses shut down rather rapidly. Travis, where you and I are in the Bay Area, that was pretty rough. Without really any optionality, employees were sent home. So health and safety was the steering central premise at the outset. Fairly quickly, and for some companies immediately, for others in the days and few weeks that followed, phase two was about return to working. Now, not workplace. Return to working, it was stabilizing. And work from home became the environment, and stabilizing work from home was solving for things like technology gaps, right? Getting people that weren't familiar with Zoom set up on that, getting people that needed firewall set up on that. But it was quickly finding a new rhythm to be able to allow work to continue. That was followed by a lot of companies quickly sort of contemplating, how can we make home better? And so we've seen a number of enterprise clients that are looking at sort of improving upon the ergonomic affordances of home. Those companies have offered stipends to buy chairs and sit-stand desks and the like. But it was really all about making the best of that home situation. For a number of companies as well in that phase two, making home better also began to include augmenting home and providing optionality near home, but as an alternative to a future return to the traditional workplace. And that's where the flexible office economy first began to light up in the service of the thousands of companies that have been disadvantaged by COVID. Augmenting home takes the form of providing enterprise employees with the ability to have access to a safe, private environment, and one that is quite likely biased toward being close to home, right? Because here in this reality of COVID, as you touched on earlier in the last segment, getting on mass transit may be a threat just as much as getting on an elevator to the 50th floor. Right?
Sure.
So whether it's a place near home to do individual work on days or in moments when the home environment is disruptive, or whether it is finding an environment near home to work with colleagues, team space, albeit on smaller scale and private and secure, so as to ensure health and safety, those are some of the new patterns that are emerging. And we're now sort of deep into, I'll call it sort of phase three, which is companies deeply preparing for a return to workplace, not just augmenting home with flexible office options in between, but most companies are deep into preparing and have even begun to open up the doors of their offices, which has got us in a very fascinating phase, of course, which is where some number of weeks in markets like New York, where the doors have been opened, and we're starting to see the outcomes, right? We're starting to see the accelerated learnings around how do the customers, the end users, the employees respond to that option of office being reopened. And it's not altogether a bad rush to get back, as we've seen.
Yeah, exactly. And I do wonder, I would say that, you brought it back in terms of this, as we've been calling it, sort of hub and spoke around de-densifying, as I believe you call it, the HQ or the core, and then really kind of offering up that flex space. I think that's super important, even for me and my team. We definitely take advantage of space, both on LiquidSpace and also in some of our offices as well. So I think it's super important to, I would say, provide additional or as many options for employees, because the reality is what trust means to one employee or customer might mean something totally different to another.
Absolutely. And there's a legitimate, a true sort of customer centricity now. That truly is. And by that I mean employers are truly and almost categorically saying, Travis, we're empowering you with flexibility and choice. Like, you are trapped at home right now. We're not, we're Facebook, we're Morgan Stanley, we are Siemens, we are Shopify. We're not going to tell you you have to come back.
Yeah.
We understand that that's a complex topic. We understand that you'll need to feel safe. But we also recognize now that we may never force you to come back, and that, flexibility and choice is going to be for us something that might be extended, or for a great many companies, a permanent option.
Yep.
And so that concept, in fact, frankly, flexibility and choice is a phrase that we've been evangelizing for 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
COVID nearly overnight forced that into the reality of what most companies have now adopted as their policy. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They are, in fact, workplace strategy has effectively inverted. Only 4 months ago, workplace strategy was centered in the asset. It was centered in the headquarters. It was centered in a notion of, we'll make this place extraordinary, and we'll expect the employees to begin and end their days there. It's fully inverted now. Workplace begins at home, and the decision around when to venture from home has been put in the hands of the employee. And now the option of what workplace is takes on new dimensions. Workplace today is home plus the diaspora of flexible office options by the thousands, plus HQ. So think of it as home plus flex plus HQ.
Yeah, I personally am tired of working from home, or should I say sleeping at work. So I'm definitely eager to get out there a little bit more as well.
And most are. I think there's been an unfortunate, maybe unavoidably polarized debate.
Yeah,
monopolized a lot of the blogosphere, and it's the argument of office versus home. And it misses the broader point, which is that home is going to now be a permanent part of the workplace spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Office will, of course, remain a vital part of the workplace spectrum, and most observers in the know are seeing that flexible office as this category in the middle is really poised for accelerated growth. It was already surging through the last 5 years, but there's really no question at this point that it stands to play an even larger role in terms of a percentage of the total workplace environment.
And Mark, you touched on this earlier, especially around sort of the employer and really having that level of flexibility that they can then offer to their employees. But how do you see workspace and leasing flexibility bringing value to enterprises, but especially now?
I think the first thing you have to recognize is that enterprises and the workplace and real estate leaders within them are having to make decisions today against the backdrop of an extraordinary list of known unknowns, right? Like the duration of the current health threat is an unknown. The comfort level that employees will have to revert to returning to office once the threat passes is unknown. The long-term suitability of the current as-built office portfolio is unknown. The long-term effects on the culture of a company working in a more distributed way, concern that many companies have, is unknown. Those are all the challenges ahead of us. Now, on balance, in the last 4 months, there have been accelerated learnings. And we now know that most companies have been able to maintain tempo. In fact, many companies have published that their productivity has held, or in some cases. Now, that in many cases is at the expense of work and life blurring. Who isn't working as hard or harder these days? We also now know that this management myth of presenteeism has been debunked, right? Those managers who were perhaps more conservative and felt, I need to see Travis's face in the office to have a confidence that our culture is being held together and that he's working effectively, they now know that that's not a requirement. So to the question of, what are the value propositions for companies that are facing those unknowns, it's about optionality, right? Against all of that uncertainty, not the least of which I suppose is the fundamental economic uncertainty of most companies.
No doubt.
Against that uncertainty, the ability to have optionality and to make shorter term bets, to be on agile footing and be able to respond, whether responding is adding more capacity when the business starts to pull, whether that agility is about enabling employees who do choose to relocate to other markets to be able to act on that impulse, whether that optionality is being able to hire and retain effectively in the burgeoning new markets that seem to be on the come as COVID is pushing whole new dislocations of people. It's about optionality. And frankly, those aren't new concepts. I mean, those tenets were what made flexible office, co-working, serviced offices a stable and accelerating industry. It was, it was sitting at 3 to 5% of office allocation, in January, and forecasted to be 30% over the next 10 years. It's now looking as though those forecasts of growth are probably going to have, if not quarter. But the basic premise was already proven. Enterprises and startup companies chose flexible office for speed, flexibility, and optionality. And the need for those is all the more great today in light of COVID.
Yeah, and I think there's also the notion of providing flexibility, but in a way that there's still those basic table stakes, functionality, features, et cetera, that really need to exist in that space so people can be productive. And so with that in mind, the sort of ready day one or turnkey connectivity, how important do you think of that as it pertains to flexible office space?
Well, speed and time to market were part of the fundamental differentiators. It's what made flexible office different than traditional leasing. Right? The flexible office was a space that I could discover online, evaluate quickly, transact with simplicity, and in many cases move in, as soon as tomorrow and be productive in the moment. And that combination of speed to market, ready to use, ready day one type of attributes that were pioneered by players like Regus and the thousands of other co-working software operators are now tenets that are fundamentals that landlords are looking to take on. And the more enlightened landlords are appreciating the fact that flexibility and optionality are going to be enormously important to the customers that are spending money on new real estate. And the more enlightened landlords are going to recognize that, as you said, Travis, it will be table stakes. If I'm an institutional building owner and I want to participate in the flexible office economy, a 90-page paper lease agreement that I spend 3 months negotiating with brokers and attorneys on both sides, waiting 8 weeks for AT&T to install the fiber, and another 6 months for the build out to be done. It's not even a non-starter. It's a non-consideration. Now, now on the flip side, concepts like Join evangelizes of ready day one infrastructure, technology that can be turned on with a click, and not just technology, but enterprise-grade technology, enterprise-grade physical environments. That is the new mad rush for landlords, is how can they instrument themselves, retool themselves to have the ability to deliver private, secure, high-performance environments, and do so in a way that puts them on equal or maybe even advantaged footings against the traditional providers of flexible office. That's part of what's so exciting about the market that we see right now, is that mobilization of institutional owners.
I love it. And unfortunately, we do have to stop there. I think one of the things that I'd love to leave with or leave folks with is really kind of thinking about how companies like Join and LiquidSpace can really help these owners easily create flexible and tech-enabled options. And I know that we're super excited to go on that mission with you, Mark. And so thank you again for the time, and looking forward to hanging out again soon.
My pleasure, Travis. Take care. Be safe.
Take care. You as well. I'd like to talk about Join's return to workplace toolkit and really kind of what that looks like. We talked about, again, that connect, secure, sense, and automate, but how does that sort of look horizontally? A big portion of that is really resilient operations, right? So lean networking, VPN or remote access, building or campus-wide cybersecurity. Those things are really, really important. But then the elastic tenancy, especially as we just heard from Mark, that is incredibly important, giving employees really options in terms of where and how they actually can work. And so what we're seeing is this big push for hub and spoke, or this elastic office, being able to de-densify the core, as Mark likes to call it, and really then focus on that flexible space. So you're going to have folks that are going to work from home. You're going to have folks that need to be in the core, but everyone else falls in this flex. And how do you make sure that you have the right product to meet those needs? And then, of course, as you want to get people back in the building, you cannot do that without elevating trust. So things, as we mentioned earlier, around pre-scheduling your elevator trip or the time you're going to arrive is incredibly important. Tracking and tracing people through a space so that you can then, as if there is an exposure, be able to quickly identify who may have been exposed to that individual as well, and then quickly take the right remediation. And so all of these things are really important for elevating trust and bringing those folks back into the space. Of course, visibility into the actual effect of various solutions is essential as well. And then sharing that knowledge, both with your operators, the folks that are actually operating the building, but obviously the individual tenants and their employees as well, I think is incredibly important. That transparency, if you will, is absolutely crucial in terms of regaining that trust with those occupiers. And all of this is really essential to determining what the new full occupancy will look like, right? It was easy to determine what full occupancy was before. You'd give 200 or so square feet a person, and then you divide that by the total square foot, and there you go. But that doesn't necessarily gel with social distancing type requirements. They're getting that level of elevating trust to get people back into the space. And then, of course, a knowledge-powered approach will have lasting value, not only today, which is incredibly crucial, and again, a necessity, but also into the future. So these are technologies that you're deploying both to satiate requirements today, but also grow into the future. And so we're really excited for this mission that we're all on, and we look forward to helping both you and your tenants in the future.